So good afternoon, everyone, unless you're someplace where it's not afternoon, and in that case, good morning or good evening, wherever you may be. It is great to see everyone. My name is Rabbi Emily Losben-Ostrov, and I am honored to serve as the rabbi at Temple of Israel in Wilmington, North Carolina. Dennis, I saw you go like that. Just want to make sure, can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up if you can hear me okay. Great, okay. So as I was saying, I'm the rabbi at Temple of Israel in Wilmington, North Carolina, and I have been friends with Rabbi Streifer for many years. Oh, wow, probably at this point, I must have met him over 20 years ago, over 23 years ago, and we were in rabbinical school together, and I'm so proud of what he's doing with La Asok and all of this. It's just very exciting to me. And I'm actually honored to also be part of his advisory board, and we're just excited to offer these kinds of classes, and anything that you want, suggestions, we're happy to hear as well. And Rabbi Streifer and I, as I said, we go back so long ago. I even babysat his kids one time, and they're now like all grown up, so it's crazy to me. And just as I said, excited about the La Asok, and just so excited about this program. And some of you may have been with me when I taught a session very early on in the first couple weeks of doing this. And so the idea of finding tikvah, finding hope through text, is something that I think we all can use, especially now, especially at this time. But hopefully the idea of finding hope in our lives is something that we're always striving for. And I hope that you've enjoyed the series so far, or if this is your first one, I hope that you will enjoy it as well. I want to say that Rabbi Streifer sends his apologies for not being with us. He is at a conference today, but he did promise he's going to watch afterwards and give us his grade. No, just kidding, but he will watch with us. So I'm going to jump us right into offering the prayer for study, and then we're going to get to studying a special text, which might be a little bit different than what some of y'all are thinking about. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And if at any time you have any trouble hearing me or anything at all, please just come off mute. And this is a very participatory program together. So here we go. And in fact, I even invite you to come off mute as we say our prayer for studying together. Feel free to repeat after me. I find that's the best way to do it in a group. So Baruch atah Adonai.
Baruch Adonai.
Eloheinu melech haolam.
Eloheinu melech haolam.
Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav.
Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav.
V'tzivanu la'asok.
V'tzivanu la'asok.
B'divrei Torah.
B'divrei Torah.
Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. And for that, let us say,
Amen.
So in thinking about what passage I wanted to offer for today, I was thinking about where we are in our Jewish calendar, and we have completed the first week of the Omer. That is, we are in between the time of Passover and Shavuot, and we are in an interesting time period because we have just finished one holiday. We're getting ready for another major festival with Shavuot, but then in the time in between Passover and Shavuot comes these modern Jewish observances. And two of them, I think most of us observe pretty regularly within the Jewish community, and that is this coming week, Sunday night into Monday, will be Yom Hashoah. Which is Holocaust Memorial Day. And actually the real name is actually Yom Hashoah Gevurah. It's a day of memorial, but also remembering our strength. So there's hope in our remembrance as well. And so when we think about that, I think it ties importantly into this concept of hope. And then of course, that is just followed a week later by Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Memorial Day, and then Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. So being that we are just a few days away from Yom HaShoah, I was kind of thinking us in that line. And what I'd like to share with us today is a text of a poem. Some of you may know it, and it's become quite well known. It's called in Hebrew, L'kol ish yesh shem. For every man, there is a name. And we instead translate it a little bit more liberally as each of us has a name. So I'm going to go ahead and share. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of this poem before. Okay, well, I'm excited that a few of you have and excited that most of you haven't. So this will be new and I hope that you'll enjoy it. And because it is called Each of Us Has a Name, we're going to talk a little bit about our own names as well as the power of naming. And I will say just as a personal, the power of naming is something that's very important to me. In fact, I even wrote my rabbinic thesis. I wrote it on such a theme. It was called Naming the Unnamed, a look at biblical characters known only by their roles and relationships. So many people in our Jewish history have such important names. And also think about how many times in the Torah we read, this person begot that person, and we have the names and then they do nothing. But what about those people who we don't even know their names? We just know that they were someone's mother or someone's daughter or someone's wife or a cupbearer or a baker. So that's how I kind of got into that. But we're going to talk a little bit about names. So first, I want to share with you who wrote this poem. And the poem is written by a woman named Zelda. And some of you may have heard of her. She's a famous poetess, especially in Israel. And her works are in Hebrew. And this is just a little blurb about her that comes from the Jewish Women's Archive, which is a great website if you ever want to explore that. Zelda, and she's like as cool as Madonna. She's known just as Zelda. If you say Zelda, everyone knows who she's talking about. She's got that icon status, Madonna, Cher, just one name. But her full given name was Zelda Schneerson Mishkovsky. And as you might guess from Schneerson, she does come from a rabbinic Chabad dynasty. She's known, as we said, just as Zelda. She was born in Russia or the Ukraine, immigrated to what was called Palestine in 1926 with her family. She married in 1950, and she took on a lot of writing. She was also an artist. Her husband encouraged her to publish, and she really was quite prolific, and you can find some of her poems translated into English. Especially, I'm going to talk in a moment about Marcia Falk, who is the one who translated, or this is the translation that we're using. A very powerful thing about Zelda is even though she never had kids, she took in lots of boarders, especially after her husband died as well. And she considered these people to be her special friends, her basically friends of the soul. And she even dedicated her last book to them as well. So before I go and share the poem with everyone, I want to ask you to either put in the chat or come off mute. I know some of you might not be able to type right now, but either put in the chat or come off mute 2 names for yourself. So you can go ahead and give your given name, which we see on the screen, or go ahead and give me something else that somebody calls you or that you call yourself. I want to think for a moment about the power of names and see if anybody wants to share. And it is kind of funny, Eve, we started off by me asking if that was your real given last name because it looks so close to lip sync. I got excited, or in sync if you were part of a boy band, but I'm teasing. So, okay. Robert writes, Robert, AKA Bob. All right. Thank you. Oh, I like that somebody put in their Hebrew name, Dov ben Akiva Meir V'Tzipora, which that is so fascinating as well. Dennis, because in putting in your Hebrew name there, you did not just put in your Hebrew name, son of your father, or I love that you put in your mother's name as well. And there's such an interesting tradition with naming, both those of us who were given names by our parents, as well as those of us who chose to become Jewish later on and took on our own Hebrew name and maybe had a role in getting to pick our Hebrew name, which is interesting because, as some of you know, those people who choose Judaism, traditionally it's Ben Avraham Vasera. But I always, when I work with people, I give them the option to choose their own parents' names, especially if they were instrumental in shaping them into the person that they became, which may or may not include the Jewish identity. Bob, I love that you put Grandpa Bob. I love that. I can see in your face that you're such a good grandpa. I see it all already. And what's interesting is even the choice of grandpa. Growing up, for whatever reason, we called our grandfathers Grandpop. And my late grandfathers we called Poppy. Interesting, my mother, thank God, is now finally a grandmother, thanks to my brother and his wife. And she's grandma. She doesn't want to be she didn't want to be Bubby. That wasn't her. But I'm loving all of these names that everyone's putting. The grandma, I love it. So I hope that you're thinking a little bit about it. Rick, I appreciate this. Richard was given, you go by Rick, and your mother in your early years called you Ricky. Oh, Sharon, nickname Cricket. I never knew that. Uh-oh, I might have to start calling you that. And I love that, again, Sharon writes in the chat that her Hebrew name is Sarah, but called Surala, which is just very endearing. And so maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. And Susan, I love it. Aunt Susan and great Aunt Susan. And Susan, I bet you're not just a great aunt, you're a great aunt who happens to be great, right? Is that Baba? I love all of this. Is there anyone who wants to say something but wasn't able to put anything in the chat before we go ahead and share the poem? If anyone wasn't able to type or wants to come off mute, just want to give anyone that permission. Okay, Susan, please.
My Hebrew name is Shulamit, and I didn't pay too much attention to it until I moved to Tucson when I was almost 50. And I learned that it means one who makes peace. And in my growing up, I was the one who made chaos. But now I definitely am the one who seeks peace and makes peace as much as possible.
Isn't that amazing that sometimes we come into our own in our names and in the meaning and not the other way around, which we might think. I love that. Well, let's take a look at the poem. And I'm going to put the whole thing up on one screen. And then if anybody, I'd love it if anybody wants to read a couple stanzas at a time. And then I think it's to preserve the integrity of the poem. Let's read the whole thing, and then we can go back and look at it a little bit more closely. Is there anybody who would like to offer to read for us? Okay, Susan, if you'll start, and then does somebody want to take over after Susan? We'll have Susan do the first column, and anybody want to do the second column? Okay, Bob Hammer is going to do the second. So I'm going to just, let me remove the spot. Okay, great. So Susan, if you'll do the left side, and then Bob, you'll take over on the right.
Each of us has a name. Each of us has a name given by God and given by our parents. Each of us has a name given by our stature and our smile, and given by what we wear. Each of us has a name given by the mountains and given by our walls. Each of us has a name given by the stars and given by our neighbors. Each of us has a name given by our sins and given by our longing.
Each of us has a name given by our enemies and given by our love. Each of us has a name given by our celebrations and given by our work. Each of us has a name given by the seasons and given by our blindness. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death.
Thank you both for reading. Before we go over, anything stick out to anybody in particular of those lines? Anything really hit home, or that you really like, or even something maybe that you don't like? I'm going to read through it one more time. I know we just heard it, but I'm going to read it one more time and think of those questions that I just asked. If anything hits home, or if anything that you particularly like, or maybe even if it bothers you. And I just want to thank you both, Bob and Susan, for reading. And I'm going to do it one more time while I allow you to either hear it to think about it or look at it. I think both times can be quite powerful when we're looking at poetry. Each of us has a name given by God and given by our parents. Each of us has a name given by our stature and our smile and given by what we wear. Each of us has a name given by the mountains and given by our walls. Each of us has a name given by the stars and given by our neighbors. Each of us has a name given by our sins and given by our longing. Each of us has a name given by our enemies and given by our love. Each of us has a name given by our celebrations and given by our work. Each of us has a name given by the seasons and given by our blindness. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death. Any piece of that hit anybody poignantly that you want to share a thought, Jean or Anne?
Well, in the Torah, God names some of the patriarchs, and some of them were given names by their parents. And that's the first stanza here. So when God assigned a name, or sometimes the parents, it had a significance in Torah.
I love that so much. Particularly what comes to mind is thinking of both Avram, who becomes Avraham, and Sarai, who becomes Sarah. And one of the beautiful things about that is the H sound that comes into each of their names, that hey. And we say that hey is a representation of God's presence in their name as well. Just like Yud Hey Vav Hey is God's name, or just that idea of being a breath, the hey being a breath, and having God in our name and a breath of life. I love that, and that you pointed out. And I would again pose that to all of you. You know, you might not go by a different name, but do you feel maybe a connection to God at any time in your life that maybe there is a name that you feel God is calling you? And I don't mean that in, any kind of a crazy way, or even calling yourself a prophet, though we all have the ability to be prophets. We all have the ability to deliver God's message. But can you think of a way in which you connect to Judaism that it might actually, or connect to God or spirituality, that you might even hear a way in which you're called to God by a name? Dennis, and then Susan, please.
Well, I think Susan was actually first, but if she doesn't mind, I'll say something quickly. When I have been studying Torah in Hebrew, I learned that Shem, unlike in English, is not just a label that's attached to the folder. Shem is your reputation, but it's also in some ways who you really are. And so when we say at the end of Aleinu, may God's name, God be one and God's name be one, it brings that in.
Dennis, that is so beautiful. And I love also what you're alluding to, if it's okay if I pick up on that, which is just the fact of the traditional way of calling God Hashem. And we as more liberal Jews don't often refer to God as Hashem. We are able to feel more sometimes that close connection and actually call God Adonai, or Elohim, or Eloheinu, or El Shaddai. But in the traditional sphere, where God is referred to as the name, because we don't want to have any disrespect, really, I think also speaks to just the power of naming. And you made me think of that, Dennis, when you said that. And of course, the power of a name, our reputation. And when you hear certain names, I could call out different names of famous people. I was joking about Zelda with Madonna and Cher, but even when I said that, I'm sure you had things that came to mind just from hearing those names. And especially in our society today, I could call out various names that could be incredibly polarizing. And just saying the name could cause us pain, whereas I could say other names and out of pride, it could call us such joy. And I also want to make sure that as we talk about names, we talk about the power of names and the power of singling out the individual. And particularly, I'm thinking of the 133 hostages that are still being held in Gaza. And we often refer to them as the hostages, as opposed to saying Hirsch, Goldberg, Poland, or saying the names of the individuals. And I think it's important that when we talk about the concept of naming, that we remember that each person is more than just their name, but they are more than just a person. They are an individual, and that power of those names. Susan, can I still call on you? Oh, sorry, Susan. I apologize. We'll get back to you, Susan, when you come back. Anybody else have any thoughts that you want to say? Please, Alfred.
The last verse. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death. Just if the poem had just ended with death, I mean, death is such a difficult concept, and almost if it was just thrown in there without an evocative image like the sea, the poetic image of the sea is so vast, and it incorporates birth and it incorporates death. The image of the parting of the Red Sea comes to mind, even with that finality, so that it prepares the way for ending the poem on death. And is my reaction.
I love that, Alfred. And I also appreciate, I think it was Dennis who put in the chat, there doesn't seem to be an even divide between some of the stanzas have like opposites, and some of the stanzas are just two different unique ideas. But Alfred, you really gave us something to think about. When you're talking about the image of the sea, what comes to my mind is also the idea of the waves, and that our lives are like waves, you know, the up and the down, and that when we think about our death, we have to reflect on every moment. And when others reflect on our deaths, we hope that they will reflect not just on you know, something bad or just one aspect of us, but that we ourselves are so vast, like the ocean, and ever changing. So I really appreciate that. Jean and sorry, Anne, and then Bob.
I think when I look at the line that says given by our longing, I think of Hannah, and that's my Jewish name as well, Anna, Hannah, Hannah. And when you pray with all your heart and all your intent, and that's what to me, she represented, that's when God will hear your prayers, that you have to pray most sincerely and with your whole self.
Beautiful. I love it. Bob?
Well, you've given us the poem to look at, and I have to make some comments and ask some questions about that. I've noticed that there are no periods at the end of what seem to be sentences, even though each verse starts with a capital letter in the first line. And the other thing is that in some cases, the last stanza in a verse is a little bit longer, but in the final stanza, our death is put on a separate line. And I wonder if the Hebrew has it laid out that way as well.
That's a great question. I have one version of the Hebrew. Let me stop sharing for a second so that I can pull it up. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned, one thing is that one of Zelda's trademarks is that her Hebrew could be sometimes erratic and not always following all the rules of grammar. And that was, you know, part of her spirit, I guess. I do want to mention, and I'm happy you brought it up, as much as I love Zelda, I'm not a scholar on her by any stretch, but I really would encourage, if you like this and like the translation, because this again is a gender neutral. The poem itself is L'kol ish yesh shem, for every name. There's a L'kol ish, each man has a name. Marcia Falk is the one who translated this. So actually, let me just show you one thing quickly about Marcia Falk, and then I'll look at the Hebrew as well. So this is Marcia Falk right there on the right, looking at us. She is wonderful. I have had an opportunity to speak with her and to talk a little bit about her work. Her seminal piece is called The Book of Blessings. And basically she took a lot of the Hebrew prayers that we use and she rewrote the Hebrew and gives the English translation to it as well. It's really fantastic. And in fact, if everyone's interested, if I do another one of these, I could even bring up some of those as some of the text to look at, or I encourage you to take a look at her book, The Book of Blessings. She also just put out a new Haggadah, and also to take a look at this book that she wrote that is, I believe, 80 some poems of Zelda's in the Hebrew, and then her translation. She's really quite remarkable, a great woman, and not only a poet, but an artist and a writer. So not just a translator. I love how this summarizes her as a liturgist. So I want to show you the Hebrew real quick. And Susan, why don't you ask your question as I'm trying to bring that up, because I know we're getting close to our timeline here.
Okay. It wasn't a question, it was a comment. And one of the things that I noticed is I have a name given by the mountains, which is very true because I live in Tucson and I see mountains whenever I look out the front door. And S-I-N-I is my favorite psalm or song.
Wow.
The other part that I think is missing is that there are names we give ourselves. And I have a very long list of them, many of them negative, many of them positive.
I love that. And I think I would say that's very true to Zelda, would be to be honest with ourselves, as you said, both the positive and the negative, because not every one of these things is positive, right? So I'm going to pull up this other translation. If you look at this, you'll see the English is slightly different, which is always the joy of looking at things in Hebrew and in English. And let me go ahead and pull that up. I apologize. I did look to find one with vowels, but this is what I did find before our session. Let me go ahead and try to make it a little bit bigger. For those of you who can read the Hebrew, this is if you can see. So L'kol ish yesh shem, so literally to every man there is a name. Shenatan lo Elohim, given to him by God. V'natan lo aviv ve'imo, and given to him by his father and his mother. So that's the way the stanzas are in Hebrew. They seem to all be 3 lines. So maybe that would be a better way to have written it out. And I think the limitation of the pages. Seeing Bob, do you want me to go on? Is that what you want to see the rest of it? Is that the scrolling? You want me to scroll down? And so each of these stanzas here, it does start, as we said, for each man, there is a name. And again, ish is used here. So for each one of us, there is a name. Could be another translation. Instead of each of us has a name, to each one, there is a name, would be a little bit more close to the Hebrew. And I think the English I showed you didn't say sins, but used desires. Here we have in Hebrew, you see the word you might recognize from the High Holy Days, al chet. So this is sins, but sometimes we don't translate the word as sins at the High Holidays. We say we've missed the mark. So it's very interesting, and I love how nuanced the Hebrew can be. I'm gonna.
Yeah, what's the final verse though?
You just want, Bob just wants the final verse. All right, Rabbi, get to it. That's what I want. Okay, so here we have just the final verse right here. For each man, yesh name, there is a name. Shenatan lo chayam, given to him by the sea and given by his death. So it does look a little bit better in the Hebrew. I think what's also really interesting is, for those of you familiar with the Hebrew, look at the word hayam And it's similar to the word, it looks similar and even sounds similar, chaim, which means life. So in a way, I don't think it's meant to be given by his life and given by his death. I don't want to take away that meaning, but I want to say how similar, if you hear in the Hebrew, hayam, hayim, or even hayom. Hayom means the day, hayam means the sea, and hayim means life. So I don't want to do anything that takes away from the beautiful power of Zelda's words, but I think it's interesting to see how there are other additional nuances that can be seen in the Hebrew as well. I'm going to go back and just put the poem up for one last time as we're getting ready to close out. And I want to thank everybody for being with us. And I want to, oops, wrong share. I want to also make sure that everyone has an opportunity, if you'd like to put anything else in the chat after our time together, if you want to think of any other name that you want to share with us, any other name that you go by or that you want to go by after we've had this time together. And I want to end being respectful of everyone's time. I will stay on for a little bit if anyone wants to continue, but I want to just close with these words, which is that as we come up to Yom Hashoah, as we come up to Holocaust Memorial Day, let us remember that we don't just need to talk about the 6 million, but that we need to remember their individual names. And so I offer the name of a cousin of mine who perished in the Holocaust, whose name was Charlotte Jaffe, and she was just a young girl. If anybody wants to put the names of any of your loved ones or those you know of who passed, who were murdered in the Holocaust, in honor of Yom Hashoah, to mention their names. And let this, as we shift from Yom Hashoah to Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, and as we shift to finding Tikvah in our lives, let us remember that each of us is more than our name, and that each of us should live our lives in a way so that our names and our memories will always be for a blessing. May you go forward today and always with lots of hope and with lots of peace. And thank you for the honor of getting to spend some time together today.